Ottawa, the mayor of Windsor, Ontario, told Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino that a blockade of the Ambassador Bridge was over, a day before the federal government invoked the Emergencies Act. Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens is testifying Monday morning at the Public Order Emergency Commission, reviewing the Trudeau government's use of the Emergencies Act. Dilkens shared text messages between himself and Mendicino as part of the inquiry. He first alerts Mendicino about the possibility of a blockade on February 4 and protesters ultimately completely blocked the bridge on February 7. Dilkens said the blockade of the bridge was a major issue for everyone, in addition to the trade value, which he estimated at between $300 million and $450 million a day. There were also problems for Windsor residents and for healthcare workers who live in Windsor but work in Detroit. He said they staged a bus near the bridge to potentially move workers, knowing how important those workers were to Detroit hospitals. We had to provide a mechanism to help move healthcare workers who lived in Windsor and worked in Detroit, he said. In the text messages, Mendicino asked, "Do you think it will end today?" And Dilkens responded, "I'm thinking it will." Dilkens later confirmed the protest would end that day and the bridge would reopen soon after. He told Mendicino there would be a need for change at the lead-up to the border crossing, to prevent something similar from happening again. "We are going to need a plan which is going to cost some dollar to establish some permanent security control to help ensure this doesn't happen again." Mendicino replied that it would change the way the government thinks about protecting critical infrastructure. On Sunday evening, Dilkens again confirmed that the city had full control, and said the bridge would reopen on the morning of February 14, at the latest. Dilkens said even though they saw the blockade coming through social media, there was no way to prevent it without blocking a major artery to the bridge and dozens of businesses and homes along that road. Dilkens said talking to his police chief they were determined to learn from the Ottawa protests to ensure the protesters didn't become entrenched. "In my conversations with the chief, the largest lesson learned was not to let this grow. Don't let bouncy castles and hot tubs of amenities come to the streets." He said the city and police were concerned about the language of the protesters, which was aggressive and confrontational. He said one protester had even said he was prepared to die for this cause. He said they didn't want to spark a riot like the G20 in Toronto and that led to them taking a slower approach. It was almost as if folks wanted some sort of brawl on the streets. They were hoping police would engage in that way so they could have some sort of brawl in the streets. The commission also heard from Windsor Police Deputy Chief Jason Crowley, who was one of two senior officers overseeing the response during the convoy. Crowley said they had been dealing with slow roll protests for months leading up to the blockade, but they were relatively easy to manage and protesters worked with police to keep emergency lanes open. He said during the blockade a whole new group of protesters showed up and they were much less willing to work with police. In fact, the original slow roll organizer actually pleaded with the other group not to block the bridge. He said OPP negotiators would work with some groups to open up lanes or clear an area, but it wouldn't hold. Somebody would negotiate a lane open, and someone else would step up and say no way we're giving this to the police, and their people would come and clog it up. The Windsor blockade was cleared a week after it began with the addition of more than 100 additional officers from police. The operation was delayed one day after a large group of children showed up, which Crowley said was a major concern. There was talk on open-source communications that they were going to use children as human shields. Crowley testified that Windsor police didn't use any of the provisions in the Emergencies Act, but said he does believe it may have been helpful in dissuading protesters from returning and blockading the bridge again. "We were very paranoid about it happening again." After the bridge reopened, Dilkens asked Mendicino in text messages if the government was bringing in the Emergencies Act. Mendicino didn't reply directly, but said he would appreciate Dilkins's support for the federal government's moves. To the extent you can be supportive of any additional authorities that gets Windsor the resources you need to keep the bridge open, people safe, that would be great, Mendicino wrote in the texts. Dilkins said the Emergencies Act was useful and he was definitely concerned that protesters would come back to the bridge, especially after the Ottawa protests were cleared. The thought was that they were coming back and there were some attempts. There were some attempts that police intercepted, he said. He said invoking the act was a clear sign that blockading the bridge would not be tolerated. From an Emergencies Act perspective, anything that would send a signal to people contemplating coming to Windsor, to start this over again. I thought from my chair was extremely helpful to send a signal, he said. The city declared an emergency, the province declared an emergency, and then the federal government declared an emergency, and I think that ought to have sent a signal to a lot of people that this is a serious matter and will not be allowed to happen again. The text message is another indication that the Trudeau government may have been looking to shore up support for the invocation of the act around the time it happened. 2 weeks ago, a text message sent by RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki to her OPP counterpart Commissioner Thomas Carrickay tabled at the Commission implied that Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair may have also been looking for public support for the act. Has Minister Blair hit you up for a letter to support the EA? Lucki wrote to Carrickay on February 22, just days before the act was repealed. No, he has not. Should I expect to hear from him? Carrickay responded. There is no more information about Blair's request in the following messages. In a statement, Blair spokesperson Annie Cullinan said the minister was not in contact with OPP Commissioner Carrickay to solicit a letter of support, nor did he request one from Commissioner Lucki.